Unbeknown to the European defenders, they had quietly and without ceremony folded up their tents, gathered their herds, and headed east, away from Europe. This, it turned out, was not an elaborate maneuver, but a complete and total withdrawal. What precipitated this dramatic event was news from the Mongol homeland. The great Khan, Ogadai, was dead, and while a new Khan was being chosen, the local commanders had decided to withdraw. The great army came to rest here in southern Russia, near the banks of the River Don. For the time being, at least, Europe had escaped Mongol occupation, but for the people who prayed in these Russian churches, the return of the invader marked the beginning of the longest and darkest chapter in Russian history. It became known as the Mongol yoke. Through a typical campaign of terror, the Mongols quickly re-established their authority over the separate principalities. Once they had extracted complete submission from the people, the local princes were allowed to retain their positions. Always too few to rule directly, and anyway not much interested in administration, the Mongols preferred to rule at arm's length. Each year, these vassal princes would gather before their Mongol masters, hand over vast quantities of tribute, renew their oaths of submission, and then bow down and kiss, literally, the Mongol spurs. Before long, the Mongol rulers of this region became fabulously wealthy. Indeed, this part of their empire was known as the Golden Horde. For the only time in history, Western Christians were ruled by an Oriental aristocracy. The Mongols stamped their way of life on the local psyche, just as they would in China and the rest of Asia. From these cliff-top citadels in the Crimea, Mongol warlords held sway, absolute power, over an area the size of Europe for the next 300 years. For a people who had always depended on mobility, the Mongols now took up permanent residence. They even built citadels and castles from which to reinforce their rule. A 1,000 miles to the west, in Europe, the legacy of the Mongol invasion was a continuing bewilderment. While many gave unquestioning thanks for their deliverance, others tried to make some sense of what had happened. The Poles quickly explained their survival by convincing themselves that they had actually beaten off, defeated the invader. A festival, the Raikoniki, was established in Krakow. Someone dressed up, still dresses up, in fanciful Mongol costume, while the crowd around made fun of the invader. A great victory, it was claimed, had been won over the Orientals, and they would never return. It was a fairy story. The Poles had deluded themselves. Elsewhere, Europe waited for what many feared would be the inevitable return of the invader.